There are lots of places where public safety is a legitimate problem, and China is offering either the fastest, the most efficient, or the only assistance sometimes in solving these very real governance challenges. So I think we need to be really careful that we acknowledge that there are places where the public security goods China is providing are valuable and valued by other countries. And so just saying China bad, China's security offerings bad is not going to be effective, in part because it fails to recognize the perspectives of these citizens and leaders in a lot of countries. So, I think that, that said, these tools can also be misused.
Hi, my name is Dr. Phillip Saunders. I'm the director of the China Center at the National Defense University in Washington. And I'm pleased to introduce our guests for today's interview. Sheena Chestnut Greitens is associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where she runs the Asia Policy Program and serves as editor-in-chief of the Texas National Security Review. She's also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and visiting faculty at the China Land Power Studies Center of the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. Isaac Kardon is a senior fellow for China Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Prior to joining the Carnegie Asia program in 2023, Dr. Kardon was an assistant professor at the U.S. Naval War College, where he was a core member of the college's China Maritime Studies Institute. Dr. Greitens and Dr. Kardon recently authored an article called Security Without Exclusivity, Hybrid Alignment Under U.S. China Competition, which was published in the prestigious journal International Security. And I look forward to discussing the findings with them today. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks, Phil. Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Well, it's my pleasure. You describe how during the Cold War, many countries had exclusive security relations with either the United States or the Soviet Union. But in the post-Cold War period, many people characterized countries in Asia as relying on the US for security and on China for economic growth. Your article takes a different position. You talk about a new dynamic, which you call security hybridization. What is this phenomenon and what makes it different from these past patterns of international security cooperation?
I think that's a great question. One of the things that really struck both Isaac and I in our different work about China's security presence over the course of the last couple years was the fact that China's global security footprint is expanding, but it often doesn't look like the US military-led security presence around the world. And we can get into more of the details of that. But this concept that we came up with, security hybridization, is intended to describe a growing category in the international system where countries have security relationships with both the United States and China. So instead of being split between China for economic prosperity and the US for security and defense, that security relationship's actually becoming hybridized, what we call hybridized, meaning that there's increasing involvement and assistance from both great powers. And that really is different from the sort of the global geopolitical security competition that we saw during the Cold War. So my first book was about internal security and among US allies during the Cold War, then when each of them went through a non-democratic period. So I looked at Taiwan, South Korea, and the Philippines. And the United States really provided both internal and external security assistance for the majority of that period, often under the heading or the term foreign internal defense. And the United States provided a significant amount of foreign internal defense assistance to try to help countries combat the threat of communist subversion. But for various reasons, the United States kind of pulled back from that game during and especially after the Cold War, and no longer really provides the same level of internal security assistance. That's not to say it does zero, but it really focuses a lot on external defense cooperation aimed at regional stability and regional security. And that has left space for China to emerge as a global security provider. But it's a global security provider that's providing a very different kind of security aimed at domestic stability at enhancing law enforcement capacity, and sometimes at propping up the security of particular regimes in power. And so that overlap where China is providing largely internally focused security and the United States is an external security provider is what we mean when we talk about security hybridization.
Okay, well, let me ask a question for Isaac. In the article, you guys describe a world in which the U.S. has a comparative advantage in external security assistance. And that's partly because a lot of countries in Asia view China as a potential threat. But I wanted to ask you, what are the specific capabilities that the U.S. provides? Is it hardware? Is it training? Is it partnerships? Is it security guarantees that China either can't match or can't compete with effectively? Why haven't they been able to compete in these external security domains?
So, as the first thing to say is that I appreciate that you used our favored term of comparative advantage in this, which gets at the idea that these are not neat, mutually exclusive categories of activity that the U.S. and China engage in, and it's just the U.S. doing traditional regional security and defense work, and it's just China working on internal security. There's significant overlap, and we have got a Venn diagram in the article that kind of clusters some of the categories of things that we see. And of course, China does do some of these things. But your question about why the U.S. Maintains this comparative advantage and why Beijing has not moved to compete quite as symmetrically in this space. And I think you pointed to a bunch of the kind of overdetermined reasons why this is an extraordinary set of, you could think of it as security goods and services that the United States provides. And to extend that kind of microeconomic market analogy, the products that the U.S. provides are most exquisite and most functional in the context of its alliance and partner relationships. And this has to do with a sort of political commitment to regional security and balancing, in particular in places like the Middle East and Europe and East Asia, that sort of integrates what the U.S. will sell by way of hardware, which of course includes some of the sort of category leading things like fifth generation aircraft, all sorts of radars and communications and high tech stuff that the U.S. Sort of uniquely provides and sells only to certain selective sort of a club good that they're willing to sell across their partner and alliance network. China is not on a track to produce that type of security relationship or security cooperation with its partners. Of course, China has no meaningful treaty allies. We could talk about North Korea if necessary, but suffice it to say, leaving aside the legal questions about a treaty, China's strategy and China's diplomacy has not obliged it to come to the defense of anybody. You can ask the Iranians about that. And this puts them in a very different position in terms of what other countries are looking for from them. And just to kind of, I know we're going to turn to those third countries, but I think it's really important conceptually to think about now. If you're in the market for security as a third country, you're going to look around and assess your own threats in your immediate environment. And to the extent that many countries view internal threats to their power as being the first and foremost, they're going to look around the world and see who does that stuff the best. If what you're looking for is being able to launch offensive operations against regional rivals or to protect yourself against a regional rival's missile threat, you're going to see that the United States is differentiated in that way. That's something that the United States does exceedingly well in many different theaters with many different partners, not something you'd look at China as doing well. Whereas if you're looking around and saying, my political security is at risk, my party may not stay in power, I may end up in jail, I may end up with in the bottom of a well with opposition leaders dragging me out. You look at China and say, man, they've done a really good job keeping this one party in power. And so I think there's a push and pull factor. China supplies more efficiently this internal security stuff. They spend more money on internal security than they do on external defense. They spend a lot of time thinking and talking about it, which we'll get into in the context of their comprehensive national security strategy. And my sense is that unless and until China develops international relationships that require it to provide some measure of security guarantee for its partners, unless and until it positions itself and adopts a set of strategic interests overseas that require it to do regional balancing, out of area power projection, they're going to continue to lag in this category. Maybe I'll turn it to Sheena rather than going too far on this, but we think that this division of labor and kind of comparative advantage conceptualization really helps us understand why certain countries have been able to pursue both of these security goods and services simultaneously.
Well, and you touched on a point, which is that in external security, often a treaty or a security guarantee is part of the package, but it's not necessarily part of what you guarantee if you give somebody internal security assistance. But I wanted to ask Sheena about that because you've done a lot of work looking at China's efforts to export domestic surveillance equipment and techniques to foreign countries. So what are the specific types of goods and services they're providing to countries to help with their internal security, and who are they providing them to?
So, broadly speaking, I would use three main categories to think about the types of security assistance and cooperation that China is providing. And again, bracketing the military sphere for a moment. And Phil, you've done great work on the PLA's military outreach and military diplomacy. But if we're sort of bracketing the military space for right now, the internal security apparatus has, especially over the course of Xi Jinping's tenure, become a significant foreign policy actor in ways that I think we're just now really starting to appreciate. And so I would group the types of activities, cooperation, and offerings that the domestic security apparatus provides internationally into sort of three main categories. One is building new diplomatic mechanisms that facilitate different types of security cooperation, whether that's joint training or intelligence sharing. And we see Isaac and I actually have a report coming out next week with the Carnegie Endowment that looks at the building of China's internal security diplomacy that's carried out by the internal security apparatus from 2022 up to this summer. And so that's really the first thing, right? Building this architecture and these mechanisms for facilitating cooperation that is helpful to China and helpful to its partners in this, diplomatic, regional, bilateral security environment. And then the second piece of this is about police training. We have a report in the works that looks at the last 10 years of China becoming a police training provider. And I should add that both of these reports are co-authored with a terrific junior fellow at Carnegie, Cameron Waltz, who has been a great partner in this project. But China is also doing a lot of law enforcement and police training. We found over 100 countries around the world that have gotten some form of police training or capacity building from the PRC, and some pretty significant plans to institutionalize that training going forward, with investments that are serious on the part of the PRC. And then the third category is what I would talk about as the export of actual goods and services.
Mhm.
And one of those things is surveillance platforms. So I've done some work on the past, you're right, on the export of Chinese surveillance technology, Huawei safe city platforms, again, to, 80, 90 countries around the world at a minimum count. We're probably missing a few in that data. Talking about export of police equipment, which China promotes via this diplomatic engagement at places like the Global Public Security Cooperation Forum or the Police Expo that takes place every year in Beijing, or the export of private security services. So we're seeing a real expansion of Chinese private security company activity around the world, including, in places like Myanmar, which has just set up a joint security company with the Chinese over the course of the last year or so. And so those are the sort of the three baskets that I would place Chinese security offerings in: the sort of diplomatic cooperation, the training, and then the actual export of goods and services. I think that answers your question, but let me know if I didn't cover it. I'll
It
stop
does,
so I
but
don't go on too
I want
long.
to, it absolutely answers it, but I want to just to follow up to push a little bit. Well, so why is this so bad? Why is this so different from the various kinds of internal security assistance that the U.S. offered during the Cold War and counterterrorism assistance that we offered in the post-Cold War period. What makes this worth special concern other than the fact that it's China?
Yeah, so first, great question. I actually think we need to be really careful in imposing too much or too quickly a normative judgment on this as all of it is bad. There are lots of places around the world that are weakly institutionalized polities where public safety governance is not strong, it's not effective. And public safety is a legitimate responsibility for a democratic government and for elected officials to care about. Think about the debates we have about officials not doing their job when there are high rates of crime in the United States, right? It's a major concern that citizens have that they want to hold democratically elected leaders accountable for. And that's a global phenomenon. So there are lots of places where public safety is a legitimate problem, and China is offering either the fastest, the most efficient, or the only assistance sometimes in solving these very real governance challenges. So I think we need to be really careful um, that we acknowledge that there are places where the public security goods China is providing are valuable and valued by other countries. And so just saying China bad, China security offerings bad is not going to be effective, in part because it fails to recognize the perspectives of these citizens and leaders in a lot of countries. So, I think that, that said, these tools can also be misused. And there's a separate set of countries and leaders, or sometimes overlapping, right? If a country suffers an autocratic reversal or democratic backsliding, which we've seen a lot in global politics in the last decade, um, then these tools, surveillance capacity without democratic oversight, can be misused for repression. They can be misused for human rights violations or curtailing the freedom of civil society. And so, this assistance isn't neatly separated in its effects. It can build capacity, but that capacity can be used for legitimate public safety or as repressive capacity that is contrary to the interests of citizens. And it's that second part that is concerning. But the fact that these tools are basically dual use is one of the reasons why it makes sort of crafting a foreign policy to address these challenges so thorny and so interesting and difficult. I guess the only other piece I'll say is that if you look at this solely through an interest-based lens, you take the sort of human rights, the repression concerns out of the picture, there is still a way in which China is using this presence, these partnerships, and potentially the intelligence that generates, the
Hmm.
influence that it can create in some cases very powerful ministries or actors in, again, some weakly institutionalized countries around the world, right? Even at a just sort of very bare bones interest based level, we should be trying to figure out how much um, these activities by the public security apparatus, by the political legal system in China, are generating benefits that could be strategically detrimental to the United States outside of that set of values-based or normative
Hmm.
concerns. And so I think that, broadly speaking, is why we think this is interesting. But different administrations weight those factors differently, I think, in assessing why this activity matters to the United States and therefore what the appropriate policy tools are. Um, we haven't fully gotten into that in our report. We're mostly trying at this point in our research project and in our agenda to give a good empirical foundation and make sure people know what's going on so that we can more accurately think about the policy trade-offs involved.
Well, that's one thing I really like about this report is you stress the demand side, that countries, whether they're democratic or autocratic, that have real security concerns, and they're trying to figure out how to meet those needs. And so it's not trying to pushing stuff on unwilling partners. It's countries that have real problems and they're trying to decide how to meet them. That's one thing I really like about the piece is you give a lot of focus on the agency of the countries that are the recipients of this superpower attention. But I wonder about this a little bit because the cases that you look like in the paper, Vietnam and the United Arab Emirates, they're really able to get the best of the both worlds. They can get the US to help them on traditional security things. They can have a good relationship with China that helps them on internal security, and they play them off against each other to try to maintain their autonomy in the process. Um, but is this a normal pattern? Because, certainly there are cases where countries in Europe were wanting to buy Huawei cell phones, and the US government went around and said, that's not such a good idea. And some of them felt pressured by that and chose not to do that. So are these typical states that have the agency, that have the ability to play the superpowers off against each other? Or are they special cases where they've been smart and shrewd and they've managed to do it? I wonder if either of you could speak to that.
Sure. Let me take a swing at that and say, one glaring omission from the paper is a list of all those countries that we consider meeting the threshold of having meaningful security cooperation with China and the United States. And I say meaningful as a placeholder for what we still haven't decided would be an objective and universally acceptable way to describe this. Um, and, you know, the two cases that we chose were very much selecting on the dependent variable, which is usually a no-no, but not
Bad
when you're
thing. No,
exploring
no.
not when you're exploring new conceptual territory for which there's not a theory that has a good explanation for these cases. And there's a little bit of theory development in this, and I won't bore our listeners with it, other than to say that there are a lot of other cases that we might consider depending on what threshold you want to use. And I guess what I would say is I think that Vietnam and UAE may not be typical cases, but they're representative
Mhm.
cases of a phenomenon, and they are themselves intrinsically important. Those are two of the key states in major regions, and we can talk about other regions and offer some illustrations of them. But I guess what I would offer uh, to your question, which is sort of more about the limits of this hybridization model. Are there ways that it's not not going to be stable or not sustainable for a lot of states? And I like to go back to another one of the metaphors that we've used for these types of security relationships, which we borrowed from the former CIA director and Carnegie President Bill Burns, which is this idea of strategic non-monogamy. And the more I think about it, the more I think of that as a really apt metaphor because you know non-monogamy might sound great for the beneficiary who's able to go between multiple partners, but it might not work out in the long run. It's going to lead to some jealous partners, and we see plenty of evidence that the United States doesn't like to see the development of certain of these relationships. UAE is a perfect example. There's been an ongoing fight about whether or not the US is going to provide these F-35s to the UAE if they continue to deploy Huawei software or entertain the idea of hosting a PLA base or integrate the PLA, or excuse me, the Chinese sort of security stack more and more into their work. So I think there's a lot of reasons to think that there will be a lot of sort of hemming and hawing, and there'll be pressures on these countries. But I think on balance, the dynamic that's emerging is that they're in a pretty good bargaining position. There's
Mhm.
not a lot of basis for either the US or China to demand exclusivity, and where they have, and I mentioned there's a number of cases in which the U.S. has fairly publicly done so. You haven't seen the countries make a choice. They haven't been forced to do it. The U.S. hasn't fully withdrawn its support, and I think that may be characteristic of this, in part because of the division of labor. It's not like there's a substitutable offer from the US or from China, depending on what they're looking for. Um, and I guess just another historical gloss to lay on it, and I'll defer to Sheena on this. There's a lot more insight into these Cold War relationships, but the fact that ideology is at best a secondary variable here, I think, is really important. There's no association with any particular political party or movement for the most part. There are idiosyncrasies in each
Mhm.
state. And what we see is, countries are in a position to sort of bargain with both sides and try and find their way to an advantageous relationship with both. This may be paralleled now in the trade arena as well. There's a big gamble underway that there will be some sort of bifurcation. That appears to be
Mhm.
the Washington strategy here, but it's not clear that decision can be forced. It's not clear that it's credible that the United States would say, oh, if you're going to cooperate with China, we're going to no longer use you as a platform for our access basing and overflight that provides for our regional security. There's not a lot of strategic logic to it. So I'm cautiously optimistic that this is a pretty robust and maybe pretty stable feature of an emerging international security environment.
I mean, I'll just say I'm a little more skeptical about that. So to give a couple examples, in the negotiations on the code of conduct in the South China Sea, we've seen that some of the Chinese drafts are pushing language. Well, you can't do energy deals with outside powers. You can't exercise with outside militaries. Now, the Southeast Asian states have not accepted those terms, but the point is China's trying to impose them. And it's always been sort of one of my jokes is you see a US policy speech and we say we don't want to make countries have to choose between the US and China in the opening paragraph. And by the end of the speech, they're listing various ways in which countries will have to choose.
Yep.
So I think that's a dynamic going forward is do you have this kind of freedom of maneuver for states caught in the middle between China and the US to pick and choose what they want to do with each of them or balance what they do. That's a pattern I found in military diplomacy. So, for example,
Mhm.
Australia doing lots of really substantive things with the United States, but balancing that with more symbolic things with the PLA to try to maintain the relationships. So I'm not going to press for an answer on this, but I think this is a question whether you can whether states will be able to maintain all their options
Yes,
going
I would
forward.
characterize it as, and this is maybe a little bit, this is one of the great things about working with a co-author like Isaac and now with Cameron at Carnegie is that you can have a lot of lively debate on these things. My best guess is that this is going to be feel unstable, but be more sustainable.
Oh,
In that I
mhm,
think you're going to see both great powers trying to marginalize the other, but the lack of an ability to provide full spectrum security for various reasons on
mhm.
both the Chinese and the US side means that that's going to be hard to actually do. So I think you'll see an intent and an effort. But as you said, like these third countries are going to have some agency, and so I think you'll probably see some of this hybridization maybe diminish over time in certain key places, but I'm not sure it'll vanish entirely unless or until the United States or China get a fuller spectrum ability to and willingness to provide security for their partners, which, for various reasons, both have been either reluctant or unable to do.
So we're almost out of time. I have one more question, though. I mean, the nature of internal security support, that touches on really, really sensitive political issues. And I know Vietnam a lot better than I know the United Arab Emirates. But there is a close relationship between the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, and you've absolutely put your finger on something that is about how do you keep yourself in power. But I wonder from Vietnam's perspective, one of the axes of Vietnamese domestic politics, well, you have this territorial dispute with China over the Spratly Islands. And, you want a leader who can work with the Chinese, but not be too close to them, not be co-opted. And that's been an axis as we've seen, who's going to be the next general secretary. Is it somebody who's seen as close to China or are they seen as more distant from China? So what are the risks of sort of compromising your internal political sovereignty if you're relying on China to help with your domestic stability? I mean, how big a concern is that, and how has that played out in Vietnam?
I'm projecting a bit here, but if I was an autocratic leader, I would not want to outsource my internal security capacity in fundamental ways to Beijing, right, or any external power. That has typically not worked out well for leaders that tried to do that. There's a long history of mercenaries not doing a great job on regime security because they don't have the same incentives or things at stake in a particular leader or regime survival. And I think you're right. Regime security is really clear in the emphasis on internal security cooperation between the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party. Repeated references to regime security, to keeping
Hmm.
the red flag of socialism flying. But you're right, right? The Vietnamese defense ministry and particularly in the maritime space has pursued cooperation with the United States aimed at countering China and building the capacity to stand up to China, even as Tuolam, the public security apparatus in Vietnam, and so the kind of the internal security players have pursued a really robust, high level set of cooperation with the PRC and with a number of different internal security actors in the PRC, from the Justice Ministry to the PAP, the People's Armed Police, to the Ministry of Public Security, to one of the only publicly announced foreign visits that the Minister of State Security, Chen Yixin, has ever made was to Vietnam. And so there's definitely a sort of institutional bifurcation inside Vietnam where you have certain actors that lead on cooperation with the United States and certain actors that lead on cooperation with China. In other authoritarian contexts, that kind of what we call counterbalancing, having multiple overlapping potentially rivalrous security forces, has sometimes generated instability and not been good for the top leader. So I do think it introduces some risks. If you have two different great powers, each providing funding and assistance to parts of your security apparatus that maybe then don't see eye to eye on threats and which person they want at the top of the system. So I would be fairly concerned, but that's based on a very broad, historical sense of patterns and what's been risky to autocratic leaders. And Vietnam, like any ruling regime in a non-democracy, has a set of threat perceptions that don't always match those of outside observers. And there are things that they know that I probably don't. And so I'm reluctant to sort of sound authoritative or perfectly informed on these things. But I do think you're right. It raises a real set of risks, not only for global political stability, but actually to the stability of regimes in these particular recipient countries where this dynamic is unfolding. And that actually really bears watching, because especially if it's a place where the United States has decided to do defense cooperation, there are American interests at stake, and also a much broader set of regional and international interests that'll be affected by political instability that if it comes out of this sort of hybridized security dynamic.
No, that's fascinating. That was something I always tried to advise DoD people dealing with Vietnam. They're absolutely sincere in wanting to expand security cooperation, but you should never forget that the Vietnamese party is having talks with the Chinese Communist Party. How do we stiff arm the United States on human rights? So both those things can be true at once. And I think that's a strength of your article is you sort of illustrate both that it is happening and go into a little more depth about how it can happen and how it can make sense. Well, I want to thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. I'd like to thank the National Committee staff members behind the scenes who made this interview possible. We hope that those who've tuned in today have found it both interesting and informative, and that you'll join us for future National Committee programming. You absolutely should track down and read the article. I think it is open access, so if you Google it, I think you can find it and download it. But thank all of you again. Thanks very much.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you, Phil.
Phil, and to the
Appreciate it.
National Committee.